Good morning, afternoon, evening, night, I guess, for some people to the east of me. It's really nice to be here with you all, and to be back, because a while back I talked about Satan, and apparently that wasn't too demonic, so I came back, and Lauren asked me to talk a little bit about the extra-canonical or extra-biblical books, basically. Talk about things that aren't in the Bible, which is interesting for a Bible study, as you can imagine. And yeah, I think I should move on with slides. All right, there we go. Adventists. I'd focus generally on two things a lot. Sometimes I feel that we focus on the bottom part, which is Ellen White and the Spirit of Prophecy, more than we focus on the top part, being the Bible. But basically, we have these two collections of texts, authoritative, inspired collections of texts that we use as somehow a basis for theology and faith. And we have a lot of discussion about, well, which one decides what the other one means and how do they interact, etc., etc. We spend a lot of time talking about those things. But what we don't spend much time thinking about at all is other texts that some people consider to be inspired, that we may not think are inspired, that were written by devout Jewish and Christian people in the times of the Bible, that didn't end up, for various reasons, in our canon, in our Bible. And we kind of automatically know that there are more texts out there than the ones that we hold dear. Many of us know, and I mean that was even the password to get into this meeting, is we needed to know that they were called the Apocrypha, though that is not the preferred term. Deuterocanonical is what I was typing in, but it wouldn't let me in, and then I realized I needed to use the old-fashioned term. We all kind of know that there's more texts out there, but we haven't really experienced them or thought about them in too much detail in general, I think. Maybe we've read the books that come between the Old and the New Testament, the Apocrypha, once or twice, looked at something like Tobit or the extra bits of Daniel. But a lot of people do not have a lot of experience with these extra biblical texts. And there are lots of them. There are lots. Oh, sorry, I forgot. This is our fundamental belief. Sorry. The Holy Scriptures, the Old and the New Testaments, are the written work of God given by divine inspiration. And our fundamental belief doesn't define what the Holy Scriptures are, except for the Old and the New Testaments. But generally, we take these to be 66 books. But if we go to another church, Eastern Orthodox or an Ethiopic church, they will have generally more books in their Old and New Testaments. But we take a certain set of 66. Now, the issue is that there are thousands, and I'm not exaggerating here, there are thousands of extra-canonical texts from biblical times. Thousands of Jewish and Christian books written by devout, religious, faithful Jewish and Christian people from that era. And they didn't end up in the canon somehow. And it's very complicated to figure out how they didn't end up, but eventually they didn't end up. They're not part of the 66 that we hold dear. So they're not part of the Bible for us. But the question then comes up, and this is the fundamental one, is if it's not in the Bible, does that mean it's not good, or that we shouldn't study it? Well, I take the example of the Sabbath School Quarterly. It's not in the Bible. Many Adventists think the Sabbath School Quarterly is very handy to study. Currently, I'm not too sure, to be honest, but that's a whole nother conversation. But other things, history, archaeology, those things are not in the Bible, yet we're happy to study them to help understand the Bible better. And these extra-canonical texts that we don't have a lot of experience with do a very good job of illuminating a lot of things that we see in Scripture. Because as we read the Old Testament, the 39 books of the Old Testament and the 27 books of the New Testament, we're reading very selectively amongst thousands of other texts that they're engaging with and having a conversation with. And the issue is even more important or complex than that, because we have quite a big gap between the Old Testament and the New Testament. I'm not going to in any way get into the dating of Old Testament books, but however we look at them, there is 300 years at least between the last Old Testament book and the New Testament book. Now, imagine just for us, what has changed in our world in the last 300 years? Think about that for a moment. Let's go back to, what year is it now? 2012. Let's go to 1712. Was the United States around yet? You start to see some of the problems, some of the things that can happen in 300 years. Yet when we read the Bible, we read the Old Testament and then jump 300 years into the New Testament. And there's lots of these Hollywood movies, right, about where people time travel forwards, and then you get all manner of hilarity because they don't understand how cars work and things like that. And that's basically what we do whenever we try to jump from the Old to the New Testament. We don't understand enough of the traditions and the changes and the historical developments going on. And that helps us misunderstand the New Testament quite a lot. And some of these things are really obvious, right? If we think about it, and last time I was here, I talked about it. In the Old Testament, Satan is there, like 3 times, 4 times, if you read a bit creatively. But on the first page of Matthew, Satan's there like 12 times. Where did Satan come from? Why is he suddenly so important in the New Testament texts, yet such a minority figure in the Old Testament types? Or as an example, which I'll look at today in a bit of more detail, in the Old Testament, what happens after you die? Well, you're dead, and dead is dead, and dead know nothing, and dead think nothing. But when you get to the New Testament, suddenly there's hints of something else. Or, and I know this was discussed a while back, where on earth does Hebrews come on all those ideas about Melchizedek? You know, suddenly Melchizedek, in Hebrews, you got all this information about Melchizedek that Hebrews thinks is known, because he doesn't explain it in any kind of way. Yet, if you go back to the Old Testament texts, there's very little on the man. And we thus skip this whole collection of literature, history, knowledge without looking at these books. And that's why, especially scholars of biblical studies, spend a lot of time looking at these texts so that they can help us see a bit more around. So, but then the question that we just need to maybe just touch on, and I'm sure this can be some discussion later, is just the word inspired with a question mark. This is a perennial problem whenever we touch any kind of text. How does inspiration come into it? I think all of us have a different idea of inspiration, because that's at least been my experience, that everyone's view of inspiration is unique. How they view the Bible being inspired is mostly unique and different from person to person. What role Sister White plays in that is different and unique from person to person. And then other questions like, are sermons inspired? Are prayers inspired? Very good questions. Are these texts written by devout Christians and Jews inspired? Difficult questions. We could tackle them later. I'm not saying that they're inspired in the same way as the New Testament, absolutely not. And even if we say, well, they're absolutely not inspired, they're still useful from a historical point of view, as in the newspaper is not inspired, but it's still good to read the news. So what do we see in these? Oh no, what kind of text do we have? Ah, yes, I'll show you. I said there were thousands. Well, we have a whole bunch of texts about Jewish characters. I'm not going to read this whole list. I'm just here to show you how many of them there are. These are texts about ancient Jewish characters. We have them about Enoch or about Adam and like those other guys who got really, really old. We've got ones about kings. We've got a lot about Ezra from some reason that's not entirely clear to me. He seems to be the most popular person. We got a lot of books about prophets, and then we got a whole bunch of books about patriarchs of the Jewish nation. And all in all, this is like, what, 30, 40 books about Jewish characters. We also have a bunch of other texts, which we call the Dead Sea Scrolls. Here's a picture of one. You can see it. They're quite small, and as you can see, there are some problems with reading them because they didn't quite make it through history unscathed. But large parts are easy to read. And there's about 1,000 of these Dead Sea Scrolls. About a third of those are just other versions of Old Testament books, so the books we have in the Old Testament. And then about 2/3 are other Jewish texts with a variety of Jewish opinions. And then we have a couple of Jewish authors as well who wrote many books. We've got Philo of Alexandria. You can see that he was roughly contemporaneous with Jesus, lived around about the same time. And he wrote about 50 books. And then we've got a Jewish historian by the name of Josephus, who you can see lived after Jesus's life. So contemporaneous with the New Testament books, contemporaneous with Paul. And he wrote 4 books, so that's a bit of a lie because his books are really, really long. So they end up being quite a bit. And all in all, if you were to collect them and put them on your bookshelf, you end up with something like this. Quite a lot of fat books compared to just this one Bible, which is thinner than most of these books in this bookshelf, to kind of give you an idea of the scope that's out there. It's literally thousands of them. Now, the question that you may be asking is, well, what is in these texts? Well, we have translations of the Bible in different languages, specifically Greek, but other ones as well. We have bits where they've rewritten parts of the Bible or competing traditions, so that there were 2 historical traditions and one ended up in the Bible and one didn't, or that one is longer and the Bible kept a short version of it, and I'll show you an example of that. We have commentaries, so people who wrote like a commentary on a book tell us what it means. We have lots of songs and psalms. The 150 psalms in our book of Psalms are not all of them. There's a lot more out there. We've got a whole bunch of laws and practices. We've got books of prophets that aren't in the Old Testament. And then we've got a couple of new things that we don't see in the Old Testament, but we do kind of see in the New. And that is, we have letters, like the letters of Paul. We have apocalypses, like Revelation. And then we've got things called testaments, which are basically the last will and testaments of famous people. They say, oh, I'm about to die, and I'll tell you about my life and give you some advice. And all of these texts show us different aspects of how people were struggling with the text that we have, how they were thinking about God, how they were thinking about their religion and their faith. So what type of things do we see in there? Well, there's a lot of theology, as you can imagine. And as far as I can tell, the major themes in the theology are, there's a lot of discussion about theodicy and evil. So talking about, well, if God is good, why is there so much evil in this world? Which is why we see this development of the idea of Satan and stuff like that. There's a lot of interest in eschatology. So what is the future? What are the end times? How's this world going to end? There's talk of messianism. There's this idea that, there's this like, there's this promised son of David, or this new David that's coming. Where is he? Why do we Israelites not have our own country or nation? We have this messianism. And then there's a lot of discussion that I think is quite interesting about the body, the self, and the soul. So there's thinking about like, well, how do we as people fit together? What is the flesh? What is the spirit? What happens when we die? Does the flesh live on? Does the flesh die? Does the soul? Those kind of questions. And then we get details on Old Testament stories, adding some details or giving us details that were hidden from us because of the theology that is in the books of the Old Testament. So that was like, in 15 minutes or so, a very short like overview of what are these texts, what is out there, what kind of things we can do. But to give you a bit of an idea of how they look, I have some texts that I'm just going to show you and show you some of the things that people were writing and worrying about. And the first one is to do with a very fundamental question that I think that none of us have really thought about in great detail. But apparently back then they were thinking about this in great detail. And that is, on which day did God finish creation? Did God finish creation on Friday? Or did God finish creation on Saturday? I'm not asking for an answer here because I think you're all muted. No one can answer me anyway. But think about that for a moment in your brain. Did God finish creation on Friday? You know, before Sabbath starts, so he could take Sabbath off, like all good Adventists do, or did he finish it on Sabbath? Okay. Now, the text of Genesis, as we have it in Hebrew, it reads this: Genesis 2. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all their multitude. And on the seventh day, God finished the work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all the work that he had done. Now, this may feel like God only finished working on Saturday. So God did a little bit of work on Saturday. It's not something I've lain awake at night, but apparently some people were, because when they translated this into Greek, they fixed the problem. And they tell us that it wasn't on the seventh day that God finished his work, but it was on the sixth day that God finished his work. So what do we see here? Evidence of Jewish people engaging with Scripture, trying to figure out, okay, well, surely God didn't work on Sabbath because it's the day of rest. So clearly the way this is phrased is confusing. How do we solve that? Well, we could either write a very, very long commentary or like a statement of a fundamental belief, or we can just quickly fix it in translation. And that seems to be what's going on here. So we see these logical debates where they struggle with things and find interesting solutions. Another thing we see, and this one is we see quite a lot of, sometimes in the Bible we have these little tidbits of interesting information. And one of these examples is in Genesis 35. The text there reads, while Israel lived in that land, Reuben went and lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine. And Israel, so Jacob, heard of it. Now the sons of Jacob were 12. And very little information is given here. We see clearly that Reuben committed incest with his father's extra wife, but nothing more is given. But in other texts, and I've got an example here of you, we get the whole story, everything that went on. Now, it's a bit unclear if they read this and thought, well, let me write this story and give you the full story, or that the person who wrote Genesis had the full story and gave us the short one. It's chicken and the egg. We don't know which one because we can't time travel. But we get examples like this, where this is the book of Jubilees. It's a very long book that retells Genesis. And as you can see, it's much, much longer. And it tells us quite the story. It's not the best story, but it is what it is. And Jacob went and dwelt towards south of Magdala Draph. And he and Leah, his wife, went to his father Isaac on the new moon of the 10th month. So he's out of town. And Reuben saw Bilhah, the attendant of Rachel, and his father's concubine, washing in the water privately. And he desired her. And hiding at night, he entered Bilhah's house at night and found her sleeping in her bed, alone in her house. And he lay with her. And she woke up and looked, and behold, Reuben was lying with her on her bed. And she uncovered the hem of her skirt and seized him and screamed and recognized that it was Reuben. And she was ashamed because of him and released her hand upon him. And he fled. And she lamented greatly concerning this matter. And she did not tell anyone at all. And when Jacob came and sought her, she said to him, I am not clean for you, since I've become polluted for you, because Reuben has defiled me and lay with me at night. But I was sleeping, and I was unaware until he had uncovered my skirt and lain with me. And Jacob was very angry with Reuben, because he had lain with Bilhah, for he had uncovered his father's robe. And therefore Jacob did not draw near her, since Reuben had defiled her. And the deed of any man who uncovers his father's robe is very evil, because he is despicable before the Lord. So here we have a text that is giving us what seems to be, because we have it in a couple of other places, a common understanding of how this went, how this little hint that we read in Genesis 35 actually took place with a lot more details. The other thing we have is commentaries, and I'm not going to read this whole commentary because the ancient commentaries are exceedingly dull. But this is the commentary on Genesis, talking about the number 7. And this is Philo, who goes on and on for about 5 pages on how wonderful the number 7 is, talking about the 7 planets, talking about our age, talking about really things that you've never really thought about, but could probably be true, like that our soul consists of 7 parts, the 5 senses, speech, and the genitals, or that our face has 7 holes in it, 2 eyes, 2 ears, 2 nostrils, and a mouth, which are 7. Why he thinks this makes Sabbath a great day is not entirely clear to me, but it made sense to him. And of course, as we study him, we get a better understanding of how Jewish people worked. We have these commentaries that give us an understanding of how Jewish Bible reading happened at the time, of which Jesus, contemporary with Jesus, would have been part of and taking part of. So, but how does this actually help us read the New Testament? Well, let me give you an example with hell. Why hell? Well, hell is all over the New Testament. This is my statement of the day to offend Adventists. Hell is all over the New Testament. And I don't mean this in any mean way. If we read the Bible on the surface level, look at the New Testament, I've given us a couple of the passages here, we see a bunch of references to hell or Hades or a place of fire, burning, punishment, things like that. And this shouldn't be news to many of us. There's a good reason why many Christians believe in hell. They read the same Bible as we do. They've just drawn different conclusions from what's going on. There is a lot of places where we run into this hellish afterlife. But if we read the Old Testament, there isn't much mention of it. There's mention of Sheol, and we have a certain understanding of Sheol, where the dead go, but they don't think or do anything. But when we get into the New Testament, we have some references to a hell where people do think and see and imagine and basically live their lives, or live their deaths, I suppose. And I will just point out that this is a bit confusing because there are actually 3 meanings of hell in the New Testament, or in common usage. One is a waiting place for the unconscious dead until judgment, the unconscious being the important part. And this is, of course, the SDA approved one. Right? There is a place, it's called the grave, where the unconscious dead wait until judgment, till the second coming. There's also belief for some people in a waiting place for the conscious dead until judgment. Not so much in Protestant Christianity, but that is a common thing, and we'll see that in Judaism. And then there's hell, which is often used with things like hellfire, which is a place of eternal punishment. And we see evidence of all 3 of these in the New Testament in different places. But we only really see the first one in the Old Testament, that there's this place of unconscious waiting. Dead or dead, they know nothing, they do nothing, and they're waiting for the day of days. But if we, and I'll take an example from Luke, so I'll read a passage in Luke and then show you a source where someone else who says that earlier on. If we look at these extra-canonical books, we can actually see quite a lot of people talking about these things. It didn't just fall out of heaven suddenly that they all realized, oh, there is this hell. We can see in these extra-canonical books a lot of people thinking and struggling with trying to figure out, okay, well, what happens to people after death? Where is that coming from? And I'll take this example because I like this story, and it's a good example, I think. This is from, it says at the bottom, Luke 16. So this is one of Jesus's parables. It's often called the rich man and the poor Lazarus. I'll read it to you, and then we'll think about this, try to place this in some context. So there was a rich man who was dressed in purple and fine linen and who feasted sumptuously every day. And at his gate lay a poor man named Lazarus, covered with sores, who longed to satisfy his hunger with what fell from the rich man's table. Even the dogs would come and lick his sores. The poor man died and was carried away by the angels to be with Abraham. The rich man also died and was buried. In Hades, where the rich man was being tormented, he looked up and saw Abraham far away with Lazarus by his side. And he called out, "Father Abraham, have mercy on me. Send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am in agony in these flames." But Abraham said, "Child, remember that during your lifetime you received your good things, and Lazarus in like manner evil things. But now he is comforted here, and you are in agony. Besides all this, between you and us is a great chasm that has been fixed, so that those who might want to pass from here to you cannot do so, and no one can cross from there to us." He said, "Then, Father, I beg you to send him to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers, that he may warn them, so that they will not also come into this place of torment." Abraham replied, "They have Moses and the prophets, they should listen to them." He said, "No, Father Abraham, but if someone goes to them from the dead, they will repent." And he said to him, "If they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced, even if someone rises from the dead." And so I think this is quite a well-named parable that Jesus tells. And it's clearly playing on some kind of common belief that after death, people were living in a place where they receive reward or punishment and they could somehow see each other. It may just be a thought experiment that Jesus makes up, but that seems unlikely based on what I show you in a second. We have the rich man who's tormented, and he sees the poor man who's living a much nicer life, close to Abraham's bosom, close to his heart. He's being cared for by Abraham, and the people cannot pass between the one and the other, right? You're in the one or you're in the other, and you can't move by. And then there's this whole conversation about like convincing my brothers, which is interesting for Luke 16, but not so interesting for us here. We mainly interested in this image of a rich person and the poor person ending up in what seems to be heaven and hell, which is hard to place in an Old Testament reading of what happens after life. Now, one of the longer texts we have from Judaism before the New Testament is a book called the Book of Enoch. And there's a lot of weird things going on the internet about the Book of Enoch. Never Google the Book of Enoch and theology, because you'll get a whole lot of weird nonsense about like aliens and stuff, building the pyramids, and lizard people and who knows what. But the book itself is very useful. It gives us really good information about ancient Judaism. And in this book, Enoch, the famous Enoch who walked with God, who didn't die, that Enoch is getting a tour basically of the heavens and the earth, and he comes upon a place, and this is how this book describes this place. Now, this is obviously not a vision or something like that is inspired in the way that the Bible is inspired, but this is the way that they were trying to deal with how do we imagine what happens after death. From there, Enoch, I traveled to another place, and the angel showed me to the west a great and high mountain of hard rock, and there were 4 hollow places in it, deep and very smooth. 3 of them were dark, and 1 illuminated, and a fountain of water was in the midst of the illuminated one. And I said, "How smooth are these hollows, and altogether dark and deep and dark to view." Then Raphael, who is the angel that is giving this tour, answered, one of the holy angels with me, and he said to me, "These hollow places are intended that the spirits of the souls of the dead might be gathered into them. For this very purpose they were created, that here the souls of the sons of men should be gathered. And behold, these are the pits of the place of their confinement. Thus they were made until the day on which they will be judged, until the time of the day of the end of the great judgment, which will be extracted from them." So he sees these 4 caves in this mountain. 3 of them are dark, 1 of them's light. And these caves, the angel explains, were created to store the souls of men until judgment day. So after death, before life. And knowing the Bible or ancient Judaism, when it says souls of men, it obviously means souls of people. All the people are gathered there. So he then wonders about them. And then I asked about all the hollow places, why they were separated from one another. Remember that there was the chasm between Abraham and Lazarus, or between Lazarus and the rich man? Here they are separated from the others. And the angel answered me and said, these 3 were made that the spirits of the dead might be separated. And this one has been separated for the spirits of the righteous, where the bright fountain of water is. So we've got 3 for the evil people and one for the good people. And this one has been created for the spirits of the sinners when they die and are buried in the earth, and judgment has not been executed on them in their life. So this is a hole specifically for people who were terrible people but got away with it. Right? They did all manner of bad things, but no one judged them. Here the spirits are separated for this great torment until the great day of judgment, of scourges and tortures of the cursed forever, that there might be recompense for their spirits. There he will bind them forever. So we got this first one that is imagined for the people who were evil and they never really got punished for that. The second one, and this one has been separated for the spirits of them that make suit, who make disclosure about the destruction when they were murdered in the days of the sinners. I'm not entirely sure what that means. There's a second one. There's a lot of interesting biblical studies going on there, neither here nor there. We got a second one. And then we got a third one that was created for the spirits of men who will not be pious, but sinners who are godless. And they were companions with the lawless, and their spirits will not be punished on the day of the judgment, nor they'll be raised from here. And then Enoch, hearing all this, says, and I bless the Lord of glory, blessed is the judgment of the righteous, blessed of you in majesty. So here we have an example of an extra-canonical text that tells pretty much exactly the same story that Jesus is referring to. If we only had the New Testament, we would only have that passage from Luke to look at, and we wouldn't know, is Jesus just making up an example? Is Jesus referring to something common going on there? What did other people think? Now, this is not the only one. And I guess I have time for one more. We have another one in 4th Ezra. As I said, Ezra was a popular guy. Ezra is also getting visions, and he asks the angel, could you please tell me about what happens after death? So it reads there, Ezra says, I answered and I said, if I found favor in your sight, my Lord, show this also to your servant, whether after death, as soon as one of us yields up his soul, we shall be kept in rest until those times come when you will renew the creation, or shall we be tormented at once? So his question is, when we die, do we get punished immediately, or do we wait for the judgment, and then does the punishment only start? That's his question. Do we go straight to heaven, or do we have to wait for the second coming, basically, in like Christian terms? And he gets his answer in a lot of words. And I'm not going to read everything, but I'll read the important bit. The angel answered me and said, I will show you that also. But do not be associated with those who shown scorn, nor number yourself among those who are tormented. For you have a treasure of works laid up in the Most High, but it will not be shown to you until the last times. Now, concerning death, the teaching is, when the decisive decree has gone forth from the Most High that a person shall die, as the spirit leaves the body to return again to him who gave it, first of all, it adores the glory of the Most High. So the moment someone dies, the spirit that is inside of us adores the glory of the Most High. If it is one of those who has shown scorn and not kept the way of the Most High, so if this person is bad, who have despised his law and have hated those who fear God, such spirits shall not enter into habitations, but shall immediately wander about in torments, ever grieving and sad in 7 ways. So his answer is no, if you're evil, you don't go straight to God, but you're going to walk around in torments, you're going to be punished for 7 ways. And then we get the 7 ways, which are there, and they're not really interesting for our discussion. So this is again the same idea, and then the next one is about what happens if you are good, then you do immediately go to God, and you can look down upon those people who are wandering in evil. So returning to our text of Luke, we thus can go to these other texts, and we see a whole lot of interesting information that shows us context for what's going on here. Clearly, there were a bunch of Jewish people at the time who had this idea that after death, before the judgment, while you were waiting for judgment, you're already sorted into certain categories. And in those categories, your life basically went on, but some of it was great and some was really not great. You could end up like the rich person is, being tormented, or you could end up like Lazarus with the fountain and the light in the nice cave. And that very much dependent on your actions here in life. So when Jesus is telling the story, he's playing on, as we now know, common conceptions of the afterlife that were present amongst a lot of Jewish people of the time. And that we can then also start to see things that are different. One of the things that is different is that in the caves, people couldn't see each other. There's no way of seeing each other. But here in Jesus' story, they could look over a chasm at each other. Now we can ask a question, is that something that Jesus is inventing because it makes the story better? Or does this have another thing? Was it the righteous' right to look down on the evil and see, oh, right, I chose well? Was that some kind of vindication for them? And other passages can help us ask those kind of questions as well. So yeah, that was my 45 minutes, half an hour to 45 minutes. If you are interested, there are two very useful books written for non-experts. The one is by, I don't know if it's Matthias or Matthias Henze. Mind the Gap, How the Jewish Writings within the Old Testament Help Us Understand Jesus, published in 2017. It's a very, very good, useful book. Shows us a lot of different ways that these texts help us understand what's going on in the New Testament. And then in 2018, I also wrote a book on this topic that is also available, looks at 7 different topics and looks at how these texts elucidate very weird things in the Bible, like where does this Melchizedek guy come from, or how many heavens are there, things like that. So if you are interested in more, there are books out there. There are also very difficult books which I wouldn't advise unless you're very much into biblical scholarship. These are useful for the people who don't speak a bunch of ancient languages.